It is very important to know that European so-called development of Africa, especially in education, needs to be seriously studied and look no further than the brilliant work of Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, where he states, "The colonizers did not introduce education into Africa. They introduced a new set of formal educational institutions which partly supplemented and replaced those which were there before. The colonial system also stimulated values and practices which amounted to new informal education. The main purpose for the colonial school system was to train Africans to help man the local administration at the lowest ranks and to staff the private capitalist firms owned by Europeans. In effect, that meant selecting a few Africans to participate in the domination and exploitation of the continent as a whole. It was not an educational system that grew out of the African environment or one that was designed to promote the most rational use of material and social resources. It was not an educational system designed to give young people confidence and pride as members of African societies, but one which sought to instill a sense of deference towards all that was European and capital. Education in Europe was dominated by the capitalist class. The class bias was automatically transferred to Africa, and to make matters worse, the racism and cultural boastfulness harbored by capitalism were also included in the package of colonial education. Colonial schooling was education for subordination, exploitation, the creation of mental confusion, and the development of underdevelopment. A European-type school system hardly operated during the first 40 years or so of colonialism in Africa. A famous and excellent response to an arrogant journalist's doubts about the independence of Africans post-colonial was from the leading figure of the Congolese politics in Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba was speaking at an event and a journalist asked a question. "You ask for independence, but you don't have a single doctor, lawyer, geologist, or even a respected journalist. How are you going to manage this as an independent state?" Lumumba responded, "I am fully aware of this situation, but I have a question for you. You have been in the Congo for 80 years, and you have not trained a single doctor or geologist. If we are to ask you to train 10 doctors, how many more years in our country will it take you?" The journalist was unable to respond because it perfectly backs Walter Rodney's point that the Europeans had no intentions of truly developing Africa. Colonial education was a series of limitations inside other limitations. The first practical limitation was politico-financial, which means the political policy guiding financial expenditure rather than the actual availability of money. The metropolitan governments of their African administrations claimed that there was not enough money for education. As late as 1958, the British Colonial Office said of Northern Rhodesia, "Until more money becomes available for the building of schools, no rapid progress can be expected, and the practical prospects of providing full primary education for all children therefore remains fairly remote." It is amazing that Northern Rhodesia, with its immense copper wealth, did not have enough money to educate Africans. African soil and African labor in Northern Rhodesia produced vast wealth, but African children under colonialism had little access to that wealth for their schooling. Africans were being educated inside colonial schools to become junior clerks and messengers. Too much learning would have been dangerous for clerks and messengers. Therefore, secondary education was rare and other forms of higher education was virtually non-existent. Africans who even had access to education were faced with certain qualitative problems, and new ideas that were incorporated in the capitalist metropoles never reached the colonies, like science and technical education. African people like the Bemba children had no program to instruct them on plant life, in which they would otherwise be familiarized themselves with, but was taught about European roses instead. Dr. Kofi Busia admitted his own alienation from his people when he went home for Christmas vacation, that he was aware of his isolation and understood his community less and less, and felt his education taught him more about Europe and less about his own society. The French, Portuguese, and Belgians made it clear that education at any level was designed to civilize the African native, and of course, only a civilized native could hope to gain worthwhile employment and recognition from the colonialists. According to the French, an African, after receiving French education, could stand a chance of being assimilated, one who would be assimilated or incorporated into the superior French culture. Portuguese fell along those same lines. Even the British, with Governor Cameron of Tanganyika in the 1920s, declared his intention was that the African should cease to think as an African and instead should become a fair-minded Englishman. There was a famous West Indian calypso player who sarcastically remarked in his colonial school days that had he been a bright student, he would have learnt more and turned out to be a fool. Unfortunately, the colonial school system educated far too many fools and clowns, fascinated by the ideas and way of life of the European capitalist class. Some reached a point of total estrangement from African conditions and the African way of life, and like Blaise Diagne of Senegal, they chirped happily that they were and would always be European. The role of church played a role in the educational process of colonizing Africa. The missionaries were as much a part of the colonizing forces as were the explorers, traders, and soldiers. The imperialist adventurer Sir Henry Johnston disliked missionaries, but he conceded in praise of them that each mission station is an exercise of colonization. Whatever the church taught in any capacity may be considered as a contribution to formal and informal education in colonial Africa, and its teachings must be placed within a social context. The church's role was primarily to preserve the social relations of colonialism as an extension of the role it played in the preserving of the social relations of capitalism in Europe. Therefore, the Christian church stressed humility, docility, and acceptance. With all these obstacles Africans on the continent had to face, that didn't stop them from their quest for better education and higher learning, because subconsciously they knew it was key to their liberation. The French administrators commented on the efforts of Africans to go beyond the limited number of cadres that the French had in mind. In 1930, the Governor General of French West Africa reported that each new school that is open is immediately filled to overflowing. Everywhere, natives and their multitudes are clamoring to be educated. There, a chief wants a school of his own, so he builds it, or again, some village or other may offer to bear the cost of fitting out a school. At certain places on the Ivory Coast, the villagers pay the teachers out of their own pockets. Our pupils often come from distances of 20 to 50 miles. African enthusiasm in seeking more and higher education was not confined to any part of the continent, although in some parts it was manifested at an earlier date and more intensively. For instance, the Gold Coast and Sierra Leone had a tradition of European education going back to the 17th century. Therefore, it was not at all surprising that in 1824 the Times Educational Supplement commented that there was a universal demand for better and more education on the Gold Coast. Among those Africans who did somewhat better than their brothers financially, some philanthropy was expressed in terms of helping African children go to school. The historical records of African education under colonial rule reveal tidbits, such as the fact that the first secondary school was established in Somalia in 1949, not by the colonial administration or on the initiative of the church, but by a Somali trader. Of course, it is still expected in Africa that anyone who is already educated and is earning a salary should in turn help to educate at least one member of his extended family. That is precisely because his extended family and his village community often made sacrifices to allow him to be educated in the first place. In Kenya, white settlers made it clear that as far as they were concerned, an uneducated African was better than an educated one, and that one with the rudiments of education was at least preferable to one with more than a few years of schooling. The Beecher Report on Education in Kenya, produced in 1949, was heavily influenced by white settlers, as it stated frankly, illiterates with the right attitude to manual employment are preferable to products of the schools. Because the white settlers were close to the center of political power in the colonial system, they were able to apply their principles to education in Kenya, and very little education went to Africans. In Kenya, there was a spat of what became to be called the independent schools, comparable to the independent churches, and in fact springing from independent churches for the most part. The independent schools, that were 292 schools in Kenya, formed two major associations, namely the Kikuyu Independent Schools Association and the Kikuyu Karinga Education Association, formed in 1929. Another striking example of African self-help with regards to education was the project sponsored by the Graduates General Congress in Sudan. Founded by students, merchants, and civil servants in 1937, the Graduates Congress embarked on a program for school building. Within 4 years, 100 schools were opened with the help of voluntary contributions. There was a similar instance in Tanganyika, where the aim was built towards an adult education in a short amount of time that attracted over 1,000 people of all ages. The organizers set up a camp where they housed and fed those who turned up while imparting to them the rudiments of literacy. When the Kikuyu peasants, or Ga market women, saved to build schools and educate their children, that was not entirely the accordance of the objective of the colonialists, who wanted cash crops, payments, and other money in circulation to return as profits to the metropoles through the purchase of consumer goods. In such small ways, therefore, Africans were establishing an order of priorities different from that of the colonialists. This intensified in the later years of colonialism, when education came to be seen as having political significance in the era of self-government. Education, both formal and informal, was a powerful force which transformed the situation in post-war Africa in such a way as to bring political independence to most of colonized Africa within 2 decades. There was also few Europeans who foresaw what were called the dangers of giving Africans a modern education, namely the possibility of it leading towards freedom. For example, the independent schools of Kenya were disliked by white settlers in that colony and by other Europeans outside Kenya. One Catholic mission report from nearby Tanganyika in 1933 warned against allowing Tanganyikan Africans to set up schools controlled by themselves. It noted that independent schools are causing difficulties in Kenya. Such schools may easily become hotbeds of sedition. When the Mau Mau War for Land and Liberation broke out in Kenya, one of the first things the British government did was close the 149 schools of Kikuyu Independent Schools Association, the 21 schools of the Kikuyu Karinga Education Association, and 14 other independent schools. They were considered training grounds for rebellion, a term which essentially captured the fear expressed in the Catholic Mission Report. Europeans knew well enough that if they did not control the minds of Africans, they would soon cease to control the people physically and politically. In records of colonialism, it is not uncommon to encounter the following types of remarks. What need is there to educate Africans? You will give them the weapons to destroy you. In one sense, those Europeans were simply dreamers, because giving education to Africans was not an option which could have been avoided. It was an objective necessity to keep colonialism functioning. So those Europeans who were absolutely opposed to giving education to Africans did not understand the contradictions of their own colonial society. But in another sense, they were defending the interests of colonialism. First, however, much as the colonialists tried, they could not succeed in shaping the minds of all Africans whom they educated in their schools. The exceptions were the ones who were going to prove most dangerous to colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism, and are largely responsible for the liberation movements that started in the late 50s on through to the mid-90s.